Well, welcome back to the Azure Podcast. This is episode 503, being recorded on August 21st, 2024. And with me today, I have my colleagues Sujit and Evan. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit about Azure and the Secure Future Initiative that you probably heard about in the news that Microsoft's been heavily focused on. So we'll get into that in a second. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about the news. I know, Sujit, you had pasted a bunch of news in there. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. There's some kind of general news updates and then some security-related updates, which we'll talk about later. But the general updates are as follows. First is Azure NetApps, NetApp file, especially popular service in Azure. But the minimum volume size used to be 100 gig, right? And so whether you need 100 gig or not, you are paying for it. There's a lot of demand for smaller sizes. People need smaller volumes, and so now they've introduced a 50 gig minimum volume size. So just to make it a little more cost effective for those kind of customers. Log analytics tables for application gateway are now available. So if you use app gateway and you're kind of doing you've got the diagnostic logs enabled, sending it to log analytics, there is a special table. So you can actually do like nice queries just on that table, right? If all you're interested in the application gateway logs, it's kind of a quick way to do that. So they've got a dedicated table set up for that now. Let's see. The other update in the general space is the Azure CNI. So Azure CNI, what is Azure CNI? It is the sort of container network interface kind of abstraction layer for any network provider on AKS, right? Because AKS, they try to make it the networking layer abstracted so that you can plug and play network providers. This is Kubernetes in general, so that if you run it on AWS or Google Cloud or on-prem, you can have different providers. So in Azure, we have Azure CNI, and now the Azure CNI, which is has been upgraded to have the network policy support for both IPv4 and IPv6 network policy. So that's why they call it, a dual stack overlay. So both the IPv4 and IPv6 policies can be applied, and this is now in public preview. Next up we have is again in AKS, and I use the VS Code extension for AKS quite a bit, and that's very handy. What it does is it removes that need to know all the AZAKS commands, because if you use AZAKS, you know that you have to provide typically like 1 million parameters on the AZAKS command line, and it's always difficult to remember all of them. Convenient way to do those same things visually is to use the AKS extension in Visual Studio Code, and they've made some updates to it now. Yeah, you can attach.
Hey, Sujit, question.
Yeah.
How does doing it in code remove the need? Is that because you're basically doing it with the menu on the left? You're sort
Correct.
of picking and choosing options? Okay.
It's like a visual way of doing the same thing. You
Gotcha.
right-click it, it's got some pop-up menu. It says, okay, and the new features are attach ACR to your cluster, which used to be something you could do from the AKS command line, or generating Kubernetes deployment files if you want to, generating Docker files, for your code, and then generating GitHub actions, right? So these things are common things that people have to do, either using AZAKS or handcrafting them in some way. Now that's all built into VS Code extension for AKS. Then you can kind of quickly deploy them to your AKS cluster. So that's kind of one of the convenient things there. And then Azure Cale Studio, we've talked about this before, how one of the things missing in Azure Cale Studio was the ability to block network traffic, right? Everyone wants to simulate a condition where, what happens if I lose connectivity to the network, or the network is glitchy or something like that. And in the past, you've had to do that using mucking around with the NSG. You'd write a script to kind of change the NSG or periodically redirect routing, change the routing table in your network layer periodically just to fool the networking packets and make it seem like there's a network problem. Now they've introduced a new network isolation fault in Azure Cale Studio, so you don't have to do all that hand mangling of the NSG.
Hand mangling.
Because it leaves the energy in such a mess after that. Nobody knows what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
So this way you just set up the network fault. You set up, okay, I want to drop packets periodically. I want to stop all network connectivity from that VM, and it kind of does that automatically, right? And the whole idea is that you see how your application will adapt to that situation. So
Sure.
that's kind of now generally available actually. And then Azure Monitor for Container Insights. Container Insights connects all of the logs from all the containers running in AKS and sends them to Azure Monitor, right? And sometimes there's a lot of logs that go on. They come in fast and furious because they have many containers, generating output and whatnot. So sometimes I guess the container insights were unable to keep up, with that flow. And so there's a new high scale mode now in container insights, right? So you can get those logs sent out and analyzed in more near real time. Otherwise it was quite a delay, right? It would be backed up somewhere. You'd have to wait for the logs to catch up and whatnot. And now with this high scale mode, which you can enable for container insights, it kind of allows a higher bandwidth of these logs to come out of the AKS cluster and be visible in your log analytics, so you could do some queries on it. So that's also generally a public preview right now. Yeah, and then we were going to talk about some kind of security related topics. I mean, Cale, you had one that you had, I believe, related to the MFA that you want to talk about.
Yeah, we can use this as kind of a kind of segue into our main topic today. But one of the things that we put in the news this week was around the mandatory multi-factor authentication for Azure sign-in that's coming. And so there's a really good blog post written up here by one of our product managers about this whole thing and like why it's necessary. It even talks a little bit about the Secure Future initiative that we're going to talk about here in a second, about being secure, making sure you're secure by default, those kind of things. But just on the multi-factor piece, for those who aren't aware, basically multi-factor means we have multiple things we have to do whenever we authenticate into, in this case, Azure, right? As opposed to just simply having a password that could be, hacked or whatnot. So basically, the MFA is something that's going to be mandatory, as I said, starting, I think what they say in the article is basically this is rolling out in phases in the second half of 2024, so right around now. And then beginning in early 2025, it's going to start to be enforced in things like the CLI, PowerShell, all the different like aspects of how you hit Azure, right? Because obviously, someone getting access to your Azure account where you're running your enterprise applications and things like that, that's a bad thing. That's a really bad thing. So basically this is rolling out, and there's different ways to kind of enable this multi-factor auth. Obviously we have things like the Authenticator app from Microsoft, which probably most of you are familiar with. It's an app that's on your phone that uses
how many times a day do y'all use it? I use it, I don't know how many these days.
It's great. Yeah. It's I mean, it uses facial or passcodes, things like that to do it, and then there's different things. There's passkeys that you've probably seen as well, certificate-based, FIDO. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can enable MFA for these other factors that you need to use there. So take a look at that. It's coming. If you weren't aware of it, you will be getting messages from Azure if you have an Azure account about this.
And Cale, just to confirm that, sorry, it just talks about mostly about the admin user, right? Just to be clear, or is it all users?
All, right?
For every user, any user for the Azure portal.
That's right.
Got it.
But I don't know. I can't remember which, whether this was in some training that we took internally or what, but like I remember there, or maybe it was some other SFI, Secure Future Initiative specific talk that I saw. But and again, I don't remember the specific numbers, but they did an analysis on like what is the false positive response rate when you ask people to pick a number versus, have them type in the number versus answer the phone and hit one. And like, it was really interesting where there were sort of degrees of false positive, right? If it was just the phone call, if you called them enough, like eventually people are like, yes, fine, I'm going to let you in so you stop calling me. And then, there's that whole science, but like, we're really trying to get really serious about this because MFA, and again, I don't remember the specific numbers, but like, something about if you add MFA, it reduces like your attack surface and the likelihood by some ridiculously high percentage, right? So just doing this is a huge step in that direction, above and beyond all the other just in time and just enough access type things that are going. Actually, that's the other thing I was going to reference. Maybe y'all were familiar with, but I heard a new term the other day that I really like. It's just enough access, or JIA, which is not only am I having to JIT or just in time access, but I only have access to what I need to do it. Again, new term for me, but I thought it was really relevant for a bunch of this work that we're pushing across our platform and for our customers.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, you brought up there, Evan, it made me think about it. And this is kind of like on a personal side, because like for my Microsoft account, right, for things like Xbox or my
Your personal
M365.
Microsoft account, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, that thing, obviously I'm using MFA and everybody should be doing that, but sometimes I get pings from that. And I like freak out when that happens, by the way, like because it's like, wait a second, somebody's trying to authenticate as me, so it helps me. First of all, I do freak a little bit about it, but then I immediately go and look in my account to see who's trying to sign in as me or whatever, because really all they need to do is have your email address, right, and attempt to sign in as you, right, and then you're going to get pinged like that, so.
Yep. Yeah, I got one from, I don't know, somewhere like all the way across the globe from the other day, and I'm looking like, no, that's not me. But, again, they said they got blocked. I just got the record of it. So you sort of calm down. But at least you're getting that insight, right? You used to never know that people were trying to get into your stuff.
Yeah, and I guess it's also related to that is if you have like a common email address, right? I think that happens more often. My email address, both my email addresses that I have are extremely common. They're very short email addresses. Just happen to have them from way back when, and so people, I think, put them in by mistake all the time. It's it's just like something that you would mistakenly put in as your email address. So I get a lot of those notifications saying, "Hey, is this you?" I'm like, "No, I'm not signing in anywhere." So it's easy. Like, if you're not in front of a computer, you shouldn't be accepting it, right? If you, unless you're actually in there. So I think that's a good feature, but. Beyond two-factor, I think another thing I've seen recently is something called passkeys, right? That have become pretty popular now. Microsoft, we're starting to use passkeys quite a bit. There's the YubiKey. I think it's like more like a hardware key or something that you can get that also serves as that. And then
mine over here.
I need to get one of them actually. It just reminded me of that. And I guess all of these things are to eliminate the need for passwords, right? Because passwords, we all know, is sort of the evil way of doing authentication, right? Nobody should do that, at least not as a primary means. And this is all a way to get away from that and use something a little more secure. And going back to what Cale was talking about with getting into the Azure portal, that could often be the keys to the kingdom, right? You get into the portal and now you have sort of this carte blanche access in a number of other services in Azure, whatever is available in that user login on the portal. And so all the more to kind of secure that login there.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, you have the bad actors, right? They're trying to get in, they're trying to get into your account to, historically to run, Bitcoin mining and all that kind of stuff. But there are the really bad actors that want to go in and take down your infrastructure as well, right? And MFA helps with that. I think the other piece that I can't remember if I told y'all I was doing this work. I know I missed a couple of shows because of this, but there's been a huge effort internally. Cale, you referenced it in terms of the work we're doing to make our own platform secure. But we published a really interesting article. We'll share the link in the notes later that talk about some of the numbers of things we did. But like it turns out, and I'm quoting from this article, right? So these are not off the top of my head. We'll share it later. But we deleted 1.7 million Entra tenants that were test tenants, non-prod, dummy ones, whatever. 1.7 million of them, and then we removed 730,000 apps that didn't meet our SFI compliance, or they were out of life cycle, right? They were something from years ago that nobody was using. Like just that effort of removing a bunch of that cruft decreases your attack surface, right? And so I definitely encourage customers to start thinking about that as well, because we'll turn on MFA, but if we turn on an MFA on a tenant that nobody should be using anyway, just delete the tenant, right? And I don't know about y'all, but I think I had 5 tenants that were ancient, I wasn't using, and I have two apps that I either need to migrate or turn off. And one of them's going to get turned off and the other one's going to get migrated. But like this, like even myself, I'm not even a dev. I don't like do a bunch of this, but I had stuff. So I guarantee everybody has things like this.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point there around it's something we kind of follow too, is around basically people will say, well, that's dev, right?
Yeah,
That's not production, right? So who cares like what's going on over there? But what I think we found historically is, that's correct, but especially if they've been around for a long time, they tend to start to bleed into other things, right?
me too.
Naturally, right? And then all of a
Yeah,
sudden it's like, oh, well, now there's a connection to production from that thing, but it only had access to this one thing, but then that expanded, right? So it's like you really have to be, to your point, Evan, thinking, say, can we like either delete these things or let's go and see what they have access to, back to your point around just enough access.
hmm
I think that's the key there, right? Because it's very easy to get your dev environment a connection to something that elevates what it can do,
yeah, yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Sujit.
inadvertently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this sounds like we have to take an inventory of everything that we have, right?
hmm
What's in our subscriptions? I think first of all, the number of subscriptions that you're going to have, it can get out of hand very quickly. And then within each subscription, there could be, so many resource groups, and each resource group, so many resources. And the thing is, what are some of the tools available? Like, how does one go about even taking an inventory of something like that, right? I don't know. I'm just asking, does Microsoft offer anything like in the portal, or is there any service that says, okay, here's what we know about your thing? I know from a networking perspective, we've covered where you
Yeah,
can get a network map of all of your resources, and maybe that's one way to see, okay, what have I got going on with all my subscriptions. But from I guess we could look at it from a cost analysis, right? And the cost analysis lets you do various things to see, where your money is going. Maybe that'll identify
I,
what's out there.
yeah, I don't. I mean, I'll just sort of speak from my experience, involved in the project where we were, turning off some of these tenants and we were, in doing this enforcement. No, would be my like. I know for a fact we didn't have those because we had to do a bunch of this in some manual ways, but it would not, because again, this is the way that we behave. It would not shock me in the least if that work leads to the same features and capabilities being exposed for customers, right? We end up being customer zero, sort of identifying the scenario and then building the easy way to see it. So yeah, I haven't seen anything pop or ship yet, but it wouldn't shock me in the least if that stuff starts lighting up over the next 6 months to a year as part of SFI. Because again, this is SFI. I think it's so interesting because it's not like historically we've done things like this and it's really about fixing ourselves, right? But I think we recognize it correctly, in my opinion, that anything we have a problem with, our customers do too, right? All this security stuff. And again, it's non-trivial to do some of this stuff. So pushing the features and the capabilities out so our customers can do as well, it's common. It's just a question of sort of, we got to secure our own house and then we'll start building the things to help customers do it. Because again, we are that, in some ways, we are that keys to the kingdom. Now, if you get into our infrastructure, now if we do something wrong, you have access to everything else. So we got to protect our boundary. But yeah, it's coming. I would bet serious money that those features and capabilities are coming. There's no way they can't be.
Yeah, I think if you take a look at just for people who might have just joined in, the SFI is the Secure Future Initiative. So from this point forward, we'll just call it SFI. But if you go look, and we'll put a link in the notes around the public, kind of documentation around this and whatnot. Some of the things, to your point, Sajid, around like what do we do, how do we get inventory, those things. I mean, part of that too is like kind of establishing some standards, which I
Yeah,
think is what we did too as Microsoft. So for
we
things
did.
like API keys, right? So if you take a storage account, for instance, storage accounts can be accessed a bunch of different ways, right? API keys, SAS tokens, uh, Entra-based, like OAuth type things. There's a bunch of different ways. So establishing a standard in your company for, okay, we're not using static API keys anymore. That helps a little bit there, right? Because now you can start to say, okay, where are we using them, right? And then you can start to clamp down on that. So that'll help you kind of focus that effort and say, we're only allowing this type right now. Similar thing on the network side, right? It's like, what are our public endpoints? Establishing a standard to say, okay, by default, no public endpoints, right? Now, obviously, that's not the case. There are some public endpoints for public-facing things, but establishing that up front and then saying, okay, which ones do we need to let through now helps a lot from a mindset perspective. Yeah.
And we've done, I suspect you run into this, Cale. I don't know if you do, Sujit, but because I touch production data, production environments on not a daily basis, but a reasonably, reasonable occurrence. I actually have, and we talked about this on the show, a year or two ago. I've got a secure admin workstation, and on top of that, we're starting to layer in controls about, hey, you have to use our VPN. You have to have the VPN connected to get to some of these endpoints. So I don't know whether you call that a public or private endpoint, actually, to be honest, when I think about it. But I'm now coming from a public internet location, my house, but I'm coming across this secure channel to hit this endpoint. So it's probably somewhere in the middle. It's like a protected public endpoint, right? Like we're enforcing that left and right. Like I almost can't do anything where I'm even looking at, just logs from the platform without being on the VPN. And the places that I can do it today without it are going away soon, right? I've already seen the dates I know it's coming, and it's just a question of when I get it versus my neighbor gets it, right?
Yeah, and I do a lot of work with financial services.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you guys have touched those kind of customers as well. In the kind of customers, especially the ones that are doing customer data or trading, things like that kind of work in financial services or even insurance, they don't even allow people to have right access to the Azure portal, right? So the Azure portal is only provided for read access typically to end users. And if you want to make any sort of deployment, you have to do it through their own internal deployment system. So they build custom bespoke deployment systems where they have their own version of the portal. So it's kind of like a UI where you go and say, I need a VM of this size, in this region with these capabilities, and then it will then deploy it into Azure and then give you the endpoint, right? And so this is, I guess in some ways, this is their way of keeping an inventory of everything because they know exactly what was deployed. There's no, because the problem we have is that we have free, write access to the portal. Everyone's deploying their own stuff with all the AZ CLI commands on the planet, and then we lose kind of track of what's out there. At least if we do it through that sort of system, they can keep a track of what's being deployed and hopefully make sure that it's kept up and secure.
Yeah, ClickOps is going to go away at some point,
yeah.
Right? Like it's going to go away if it hasn't already for some customer.
Yeah, and to something you mentioned earlier when you're talking about the news, Sujit, and this hits home for me because I work on a lot of dev tools, right? VS Code extensions, AZCLI extensions, those kind of things. Something I always try to keep in my mind, and I push on the team to think about, and anybody who's authoring these things should think about this too. Don't always make it so you can just create everything from VS Code, right? Because people won't have access to do that in the future, and they probably shouldn't, right? Like to your point, they're using internal portals. There's a whole other mechanism for how that resource got created. So being able to say, I can use this extension to attach to things that are already there using my identity, this is key, right? To make sure that
I see.
SFI
So
works
you're
way through. Yeah.
Does VS Code? I should probably know the answer to this, but I don't. But does VS Code understand the concept of JIT, or do you have to do your JIT elsewhere and then you can do the operation through VS Code?
Typically it's done the second way, right? You JIT outside, and then you basically use this tool to do your thing. Just think of it like a tool, right?
Yeah.
It's possible to integrate it, but that tends to become a little clunky. But
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's something to think about for anybody who's building
sure.
tooling and things around this, is make sure that you can do that. We think about it just from a production standpoint. I mean, typically we don't have people deploying production stuff from VS Code directly. Typically that's more of a developer environment, but in all seriousness, being able to attach those things is important. Same thing with the CLI. So I just wanted to call that out.
No, that's a good point, Cale. That's a good point.
Yeah, I thought I'll take this time to cover two more updates in the security space, just to show how we're kind of moving in that area. One is the FIPS, standard, which is
Hmm.
the Federal Information Processing Standard 140-2. It's kind of like a U.S. government standard, right? For minimum standard for any system that should run their workloads. And now we've made that available with AKS, so you can just configure, tell AKS that you want to support that standard. What it does is it takes the image, the node images, and will swap them out for another image that has got that FIPS, compliance. So all of the security requirements under FIPS, be it the encryption standards that you use in there, the minimum number of bits for your keys and whatnot. All of that is enforced in that standard. So it swaps out that image with another image, and now you're FIPS compliant. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that your applications can run on that, because maybe your apps are not FIPS compliant, and then things will start breaking, right? So they do recommend you try that out first. Obviously, make sure your apps work before doing it. But doing it in AKS is pretty easy now. You just kind of enable it, and it will swap out the image for another node image. All your apps will continue running as long as you've tested them. And then another kind of feature that they've added with NetApp files, which we talked about earlier, where we said the minimum is 50 GB now, is there are users that are concerned about encryption, right? We've always had
Hmm.
encryption at rest, but they're worried that, even that encryption at rest, somebody may get access to those keys. Like, what happens if someone gets access to the encryption keys? So now they've added double encryption at rest on NetApp files. So if you're, again, to show that you can have that level of security if you want to, you can. There's two
What
sets of keys that you can have in there.
what is the double encrypt? You're basically like it is literally two layers of encryption on the same resource.
Correct.
So you have to
Yes.
have both keys. So just getting one
Correct.
is not okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And apparently the way that they do it, because even with the way encryption works, obviously when you change one of the keys, all of your data is not getting re-encrypted.
Yeah.
It's the what's the key encryption key, right? So there's a key that's encrypting the key that is used to encrypt the volume. So
Yeah.
the underlying key is never changed. Obviously, re-encrypting a whole file system might take days, but it's the key encryption key, and now they'll have another key
Yeah.
to encrypt the key that's encrypting the key. So yeah, multiple levels of sort of security out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, last thing I'll mention, and then we can wrap here, is I just wanted to mention that we talked about the well-architected framework a few times on the podcast before,
Mhm.
and we also have a lot of good documentation besides the SFI, the main website. We'll put that link out there, but there's also a new kind of updated best practices design patterns for security that kind of go along with this and match directly into the SFI initiative. So I wanted to call that out as well. We'll put the link to that. It's in our Microsoft Learn site. It's got a lot of great docs for folks who are looking to kind of be a part of this and secure your environment much better.
For sure. For sure.
That's a good point, Kale. So it's not only just taking inventory and kind of fixing what you have, but also going forward. You want to build your apps in a way that meet these secure standards, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
The other, I want to throw one other comment because this is another thing that somebody um, shared with me the other day. Start making the changes on your net new stuff today. Everybody gets spun around like, how do I backport all my other stuff? And the reality is, if you just start doing it today forward, it's sort of like the time value of money, right? You will just gradually see your environment shift to a happy place without doing any sort of extra work of the migration. Just because old things will get deprecated, they get turned off. But like that was the other thing that sort of flat a light bulb in my head the other day when somebody was showing me the data. Like, it is, don't wait. Just start net new today. That'll put you in a much better place tomorrow versus if you just try and focus on migration. Like, you got to do both.
Yeah.
Don't delay the new to fix the old. Just start with the new at a minimum.
Yeah,
And
that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add to that, like, I think from a prioritization perspective, I would also put these security fixes,
Absolutely.
migrations, work kind of prioritize over any feature development for now.
For sure.
To make sure that we are meeting this SFI standard at least, and then you can go back to business as usual.
For sure. Awesome. Well, great topic. Security first, right? It's in our commitments now. It's a net new one for all of us, right? Not just any random dev, but all of us across the company. So, yeah, awesome, great, cool conversation. Thanks, folks.
Good discussion. Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
See y'all.